Greetings, namaste, welcome to people in the US, in India surely, and hopefully some people at least tuning in Australia for our conversation today with Professor Salvatore Babones, whom I will refer to as a friend, though till today we have not seen each other face to face, but we have had some talk before, and surely in terms of introducing Professor Babones, I don't really think I need to, because I think he's more famous now than all four of us on this panel put together. I believe the last that I saw was his Twitter following was something 55,000 plus. So and then what I liked was he now also tweets in Kannada, my language. That is my language, and I said, okay, now I'm going to call him my friend. But then again, not everyone knows, or not everyone has followed Salvatore's many now interviews with a variety of media, both the big media in India, and many of us small media platforms, journalists, and media outlets that have really sought out his time and expertise. And what really I have liked is that Salvatore has been so generous with his time, and that indeed makes him an interlocutor worth having a conversation with. And today, basically, what I'm going to label this a conversation rather than an interview, though we have questions for him. But I hope from questions we can kind of segue onto some conversation so that we can explore some of the topics, some of the issues that we really want him to talk a little bit more about. And again, because he has been talking to quite a few people, he has covered quite a lot of ground. And therefore, we don't also want to simply keep repeating ourselves or asking the same questions. So with that said, this is something that I also want to kind of mention before we get onto this conversation and before I introduce my fellow hosts here. In that, as an academic, by the way, while I am a professor of communication, I'm also the editor of India Facts. And so I wear this kind of hats, but then it is interesting to see how these days both academics and journalists who have seemed to kind of either, embraced or kind of, simply acknowledging the fact that, the idea of objectivity is somehow no longer worthwhile pursuing. And therefore, this line between a journalist and an academic, between an activist and an academic, seems to be all blurred. And this is something that I want to come back to at some point in our conversation today with Salvatore about that and about the dangers of crossing those lines and what that ambiguity means for us, those who call ourselves journalists or academics and scholars. So with that said, I want to introduce briefly my fellow panelists. And with me are today Ramsundar Lakshmi Narayanan, who has done a wonderful presentation for us at India Facts. He's an IT executive with experience in data analytics, which then kind of experience in that field has led him to create this artificial intelligence based tool called hindumesia.ai, which kind of looks at anti-Hindu sentiment expressed on Twitter. And it's the kind of a first of its kind of a tool, which we really are hoping that Ram is going to develop further and extend it to studying other social media platforms and maybe even other media. Ram is based in Chicago, and by the way, he is part of the Indic Academy group to which I belong. And Ram can be reached at on Twitter at hindumisia.ai. My other panelist here today is Nishant Limbachia, who is an engineer, earned his mechanical engineering degree from MS University in Vadodara, India, has an MBA from the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. He is involved in Hindu community activities in the Chicago area. And also, by the way, he writes for us, India Facts, the monthly report based on Ram's hindumisia.ai data. Nishant also lives in the Chicago area and is also a member of the Indic Academy. And finally, today with me, I have Avatans Kumar, who is a columnist, public speaker, activist, writes about everything from politics, culture, religion, Indic knowledge, tradition. He's a regular columnist for India Currents, Times of India, Sunday Guardian. And by the way, I want to acknowledge this. He is also the recipient of the San Francisco Press Club Journalistic Excellence Award, both last year, 2021, but previous year, 2021, and last year, 2022. So these are my fellow hosts today. And and since we have limited time, and I want to make sure that if we have questions at the end from those who have logged in today, I want to make sure that we have some time for those questions. With that said, let me start off, Salvatore. You said you have begun working on a book on India, and you have, from the interviews that I have watched of you, you have kind of given some inkling about the kind of preparation that you have been doing for this. What I want to find out is, while you have already mentioned, how India, when India, why India, those matters you have already covered. I want to find out how long have you been working on the book, and what is going to be the thrust of the book?
So first off, Ramesh, Navus Snehitaru and Dhanyavadagulu for bringing me here today. I really appreciate it. I've been working on the book for, I guess, 3 years now, since, well, coincidentally, the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. I set out on this effort at the beginning of 2000, after I came back from a sabbatical. The sabbatical for an academic is a time to recharge and to rethink what you want to work on. And I realized over the course of that 2019 sabbatical that India was not only a standout case, but it was a standout case in ways I didn't realize. I had been studying India from the standpoint of its economy. My own background is as someone who has, well, I'm a comparative quantitative sociologist, so I do broad cross-national comparisons, but substantively, I've mainly applied that to the study of post-socialist transition economies. My early work had been on Russia and East Central Europe. Throughout the 2010s, I wrote mostly about China and the Chinese economy. And then in 2019, I started thinking, what's my next big project? And I was going to study the Indian economy and India's centrality in the global economy in the pre-modern era, and then potentially in the new era, in the postmodern era. So, up until the beginning of modernity, which we usually date to the long 16th century, India, I think, was at the center of global economic networks, something that scholars seem to have missed out on, that trade from China to India and trade from India to the West were the two main forms of long-distance trade. Of course, all of that changed with the coming of the modern world and seaborne transportation centered on Europe. But now in the 21st century, when those geographical networks set up by the modernization of the world economy, when those were no longer becoming so important, when electronic networks were now becoming important, my thesis was that India was returning to a central place in the global economy. And that's what I planned to do. In 2019, I was doing a lot of research around this. I'd written a book called BRICS or Bust, as a co-authored book with the German economist Hartmut Elsenhans, in which I wrote the India chapter, the I out of the BRICS. And I was really interested in studying the Indian economy. But it struck me as I was doing that research that really the standout thing about India was not its economic growth. I mean, I'd written several times about post-socialist economies having rapid growth into middle income status. And writing that same story about India, while it interested me, it didn't excite me. What excited me was writing about India as a democracy, because it really struck me during that 2019 sabbatical that India is, for all practical purposes, the only post-colonial country that seems to have cracked the code on how to remain a democracy. It has 75 years of democracy, or if you want to quibble over the emergency, certainly India has been a well-institutionalized liberal democracy for at least 40 years now. And that's a record that no other poor developing post-colonial country can match. Now, as an international quantitative comparativist, that really stuck out for me like a sore thumb. My thumb's not sore, but you get the idea that India was this truly exceptional case. It was, and I've used this word repeatedly and advisedly, the world's most extraordinarily successful democracy. Not an ordinarily successful democracy, not one of those countries we would expect to be a democracy, but an extraordinarily successful one. And that led me to really some very exciting but very new research. So the reason the book hasn't come out yet is I've spent the last 3 years reading, going back to the founding documents of Indian democracy. So I read through much of the independence era literature. Wonderfully for me, almost all of it is in English. There is a little bit that's in regional languages in India, but most of the people who would have written in Hindi instead wrote in English, and the national debate was in English. So although I'm missing some Marathi books, some Bengali books, there are, I'm sure, some Kannada books, the heart of the literature is in English. The Constituent Assembly debate, of course, was conducted entirely in English. So it was accessible to me in a way that documents in other countries and regions I'd studied were not accessible. I am sadly a monolingual American and have no plans to change that. I would love learning a few phrases here and there, but I'm not going to become fluent in Kannada or in Hindi anytime soon. So I've been diving into the independence era literature, of course, diving into the partition literature, reading a lot of speeches of the time, going back and reading contemporary newspapers. But then also in the current era. So in the last year, I've started reading the contemporary literature on Indian democracy. And of course, I'll have a chapter in the book about the civilization state debate, which is something that's, I think, very exciting to talk about. I'll have a chapter about the rankings, the rankings of Indian democracy and the Western, mostly Western literature criticizing Indian democracy today. So that's where the project is at. I've written at this point, I guess, about 25,000 words of the book. So it's about 1/3 written, and I hopefully will finish the book this year.
Let me follow up on that. As you know, these days, when we talk about expertise, scholars tend to focus on maybe one country, one specific region of one country, and so on. And you're delving into Indian affairs. And I know your August 2022 article was what really, I think, set the ball rolling in terms of the kind of interest. Suddenly, oh, who is this man who is writing sympathetically? Because we have gotten so used to India being characterized as a failed state, if not, all of these kinds of things that if a nuclear bomb will go off, it will go off in India. Population will explode in India. Poverty will break India apart. Hundreds of millions. So the whole thing, we had gotten so used to that kind of bad mouthing of India that, when you wrote that piece, suddenly said, this person seems to be really focused on looking at, this kind of data. And you saying, look, India is not an ordinary democracy or a successful democracy, but it's an extraordinarily successful. It's a kind of a standout country. Given that acknowledgement, would you, and then, maybe some of your critics might say, oh, you can't just start from 1947, or maybe just, just before, maybe even a century before that, because India as a civilizational state is millennia old. It is maybe one of the oldest. And would you not therefore be looking at what makes India India, and therefore has the kinds of qualities or features that makes democracy not just, successful, a successful experiment, that India literally is a place where democracy will thrive because of its civilizational nature. So do you have any thoughts on that?
The tension between the systematic social sciences and the in-depth area studies work has been going on for 150 years now, and it goes back all the way to the foundation of the social sciences. This is, in the social sciences, this is known as the debate between ideographic and nomothetic methods, and it goes back to what's called the Methodenstreit, the methods battle that went on in 19th century Germany. Sociology was essentially founded on the principle that we could study societies systematically, viewing societies as a unit of analysis. Now, we've always had pushback from people who study one particular society or culture. So some people specialize in, say, being an India specialist as opposed to being a comparativist. I'm not studying India as such. I'm studying India as a case that I compare to other cases. So when I come to India, I'm coming to it from a comparative perspective, not from a deep knowledge of India itself. I don't read Sanskrit. I have a reasonable working knowledge of Indian history, but I don't have a strong knowledge of Indian history. And I'm comparing India's historical experience to the historical experiences of other countries. So every time someone says, India has an ancient civilization with thousands of years of history, I acknowledge that, I respect that, but also inwardly, forgive me, my social science heart, I roll my eyes a bit, because every society has a multi-thousand-year history as a distinct civilization. And if we accept the principle that you can only study something by knowing it in depth, well, then we can never compare anyone. Now, in truth, you need both, right? If I were going to be a Sanskrit scholar, obviously I would have to have deep knowledge of India. But if I'm going to write about democracy, we see a lot of international regularities in studying democracy. Many countries try to trace their own democracies to their unique civilizational heritage, when in fact almost everybody has representative democratic systems loosely based on either the American or the British model. And the American model itself is, of course, based on the British model. So we really have one model of democracy that's been exported to the whole world. It's adapted to local conditions. But I don't think we really need a lot of deep historical and linguistic knowledge of any one case to study the international regularities. Of course, there will be distinctiveness about India, but anyone who thinks that you need a deep knowledge of India to study Indian democracy really has to ask, well, why do so many of you comment on American democracy? Or actually, how can we have democracy at all? Because most people voting don't have that deep knowledge of their society. So, look, it's a valid criticism. It's a valid question. Of course, there's an important role for Indic studies. There's an important role for South Asian studies. And I know Indic studies and South Asian studies have bizarrely been somehow set against each other. But my role is neither of those. I mean, my role is to look for systematic international comparisons. I freely acknowledge that there are roots that can be traced in India to try to find antecedents for democracy. But I could say the same, for example, about Greece. Greece, we talk endlessly about ancient Athenian democracy, and I'm sure many Greeks are very proud of it. I'm half Greek myself by origin, but let's be frank, modern Greek democracy has no connection whatsoever to ancient Athens, other than the fact that it's in the same place. And I think forgive me, the same is essentially true of Indian democracy. Yes, there were ancient Indian city-states that were democratic in the same way that Athens was democratic. That's no surprise. They both come from a shared Indo-European heritage. They have very close linguistic roots. They have very close cultural roots. The fact that they both had ancient democracies is, I think, unremarkable. Well, it's interesting, but it has very little to do with modern representative liberal democracy in Greece, India, or the United States.
Wonderful. We may have to come back for another conversation with you to explore that further, but I believe Avathans is waiting with a question for you.
Yes, thank you, Professor, for being here. So I would like to know, I mean, you're an American. You grew up here. You ended up being in Australia.
Right.
Can you trace that journey, your academic journey precisely, from US to Australia? And do you find any difference between how the academic world presents itself in the US and in Australia, and now that you are also connected with India, how it compares to India, both as an American academic and Australian academic? And also, what you talked about democracy is, we all have democracy, but there are all nuances with the democracy. I mean, there is there's parliamentary democracy, presidential democracy, we have Republican democracy, we have majoritarian democracy, and also democracy at the more lower level, individual level, means different things for different people. Sure. And how do we reconcile those differences with one, should I say, majoritarian approach towards democracy? And many Indians feel that what the democracy we have, constitutional democracy in India, is very alien in many respects to us. So if you can address these topics. Thank you.
Sure. As far as my academic biography, that's very simple. I graduated from Johns Hopkins with a PhD in 2003. I got a job at University of Pittsburgh, where I taught for 5 years. When I was ready to go up for tenure, that's a very vulnerable moment in the career of American academics, and most of us tend to go on the job market if we're mobile and able to move. And so I went on the job market in 2008, just before going up for tenure. I got several offers, but this one in Sydney stood out for several reasons. It was more money. It was less teaching. It was more sabbatical time. And crucially, it was beautiful weather. And I really wanted to get out of the Pittsburgh darkness and snow. I loved Pittsburgh. Anyone listening in Pittsburgh, it's a fantastic city to live in, except for the weather. And so moving to Sydney has just been a godsend as far as healthy living and fresh air goes. And I absolutely love living here. Australian academia is much closer to British academia, so it is very much on a British model and in many ways similar to an Indian model as a result as well. So administratively, it's different, but as far as our intellectual work, it's all very similar. The social sciences in Australia tend to be very qualitative, so I was hired in as the quants guy in my school, and I remain one of the very few quantitatively oriented academics in my school at the University of Sydney. There are lots of quants people in Australia, but they're not in the social sciences. That said, what we do is the same. We publish in the same journals. There's really not much difference between the research life or even the teaching life of an academic in Australia or in the US or anywhere. And this actually comes very close to home for me because my own research evolves out of what's called a world society and a world systems tradition in sociology, mostly centered in the US. And the most prominent world society scholar is John Meyer of Stanford University, whose work on world society focused initially on universities. He's an educational sociologist, and he argued that we had convergent institutional forms around the world. Essentially, if you were going to set up a university today in any country, whether it's Indonesia or Burkina Faso, you're going to set up a university on the model that already exists in Western countries. You're either going to set up a British or an American style university, maybe a German style university. And the British, American, and German styles, although they were all different 100 years ago, have themselves all converged into having very similar approaches to how a university is run. German universities are very actively moving on to the American model and have been for the last 2 decades. British universities really for the last decade or so have been moving towards an American model, which has become hegemonic across the world. And I would say the same is true of democracy. So, what democracy is for most people in the world today is representative liberal democracy. Yes, it's in theory, you could have other kinds of democracy, but when people start saying, oh, there's a direct democracy, look at this small Swiss canton that operates on a direct democracy principle. I say, well, yeah, but once you say that, we all know that that is a perverse case. Most democracies, most well-institutionalized democracies, I would say all democracies that function for more than about 3 decades are liberal, representative liberal democracies. And lest anyone object to the word liberal, go to the BJP's own website. They repeatedly stress that they are a liberal political party. And for all what their critics may want to say about them, I think that's fundamentally true. Both the BJP and the Congress are fundamentally liberal political parties operating in a liberal democracy. So while I understand there are many people in India, as there are in almost every country, who intellectually rebel, not physically rebel, but intellectually rebel against the notion of a specifically liberal democracy, the fact is that's the form. Now, whether it's the right form, we could debate. That's a philosophical question. I'm a sociologist, not a philosopher. From my standpoint, that's just the standard form of democracy around the world today.
Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose the Iranians and the Chinese may
they're
say,
yes, but we all laugh when we say that because even in Iran, people don't really think Iran is a democracy. Even in China, people don't really think that China. When you ask people in China what's a democracy, oh, America. When Chinese people have a pro-democracy protest, they put up a Statue of Liberty. It's we all. I mean, academics and intellectuals can split hairs over this and have angels dancing on pins, but the practical fact for practical social scientists is that representative liberal democracy is what democracy means in the world today.
Okay. With that, maybe a little change here. Nishant, I believe, has a question.
Yeah. So thanks, Professor, for joining us and giving us the opportunity to interact with you. In a latest piece that you wrote in Quadrant, you said something about a silent majority being kind of silent, right? And the self-appointed experts kind of taking over and shaping the conversation or narrative, so to speak. My question is, and there's a huge line that I have kind of taken out, but I'm not going to paraphrase it. How does the silent majority kind of change the narrative that we have? What are the tools that they have or possibly can have? And an addendum to that would be specifically in terms of India. We see all these different indices, right? And we talked about how India is the extraordinarily successful democracy, but it's still not portrayed that way in various journals, papers, and everywhere. So, what are the blind spots in India's response when it comes to all these indices? So, two-part question. Thank you.
So a piece you're referring to is called The Great Awakening and the Tyranny of the Minority. And it is actually based, it was a speech, but it's a speech based on the work of John Stuart Mill, the classical liberal philosopher. And the speech was invited to a philosophy forum. That's why it's much more philosophical than most of what I would write. It is John Stuart Mill was very concerned about the tyranny of the majority. Yet he kept giving examples of the majority that essentially I said in my piece that, what he says is the majority is really the majority of a small sliver of society that he is concerned with. So his tyranny of the majority was the tyranny of upper middle class manners in 19th century England. And it was inconceivable to me that he really meant the majority of society in a numerical sense, because he wasn't talking about everyone has to bow down to the opinions of coal miners and domestic servants and shopkeepers. He was saying everyone has to bow down to the opinion of their neighbors. And it's very clear from the piece he was talking about academics, intellectuals, clergymen, and he was rebelling against the tyranny of his peers, essentially. And I'm very sympathetic to his argument because, and this is from On Liberty, so anyone wants to go to the original, just read John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, his most famous work. I'm very sympathetic to this argument because I myself think there's today a groupthink tyranny of an intellectual minority, and I'm not the first to observe this. Jonathan Haidt has become very prominent in his writing about the need for intellectual heterodoxy and in the foundation of the Heterodox Academy, and all of this research in the U.S. about how academia has gone from being, we have some statistics on political donations in the U.S. and how it's gone from being 60-40 or 80-20 Democrat-Republican to being, in some cases, 98-2, or in the case of Twitter, Twitter employees, more than 99, I think was 99.8% Democratic donations. Now, I'm neither a Democrat nor a Republican. I want to be clear. People often seem to think that because I repeatedly insist on the legitimacy of a maligned point of view, that I hold that maligned point of view. And I think anyone who goes through my entire CV would find that I've taken many views over the years that don't align with any one political party. But I am very sympathetic to the idea that we've seen a new homogeneity among the intellectual class, especially in the United States and in the Anglo-American world, but that's spreading out to much of the rest of the English-speaking world. And that homogeneity is something that happened before, and it's something that has happened now, will probably happen again. But we're at the point where the pendulum really should start swinging back towards more heterogeneity. And, organizations like yours, like India Facts, organizations like the Indic Academy, in the Indian scene, they're doing this, right? So if the academy won't create space for alternative points of view will rise outside the academy. And, we've seen that in the US, for example, where the most popular talk show host in the US is Joe Rogan. I mean, and not by a little, by a factor of 10, the most popular talk show host in the U.S. is Joe Rogan. If they wouldn't make a space for the Joe Rogans of the world on cable television, well, he'll make his own space. Sure. Right? And so we see the pendulum swinging back, and I think it's a good thing for democracy. Now, again, it doesn't mean that I endorse Joe Rogan. It means that I endorse the existence of Joe Rogan. And there's a big difference there. And in the same way, I've been relentlessly pilloried for saying that American democracy is better off for the Donald Trump phenomenon. And I'll say it again, American democracy is better off for having the Donald Trump phenomenon. Doesn't mean I necessarily support Donald Trump. It means that the system is better if it has challengers, as opposed to a system where the intellectual elite simply stitch up everything among themselves and then present a united front to the rest of society.
So that would mean, in terms of the Indian context, the BJP was necessary for the growth and diversity and the soundness and the health of Indian democracy.
I think very much so, and we can see that. Again, I'm a comparativist, so I'll give a U.S. example. The era that most of my political science colleagues embrace as the great era of American democracy is the post-war era, from the 1950s through maybe the 1990s. It's the era in American democracy with the lowest voter turnout since the 1810s. Okay. So the part of the era of American democracy, of controlled democracy in which alternative voices aren't able to break through, that era that's preferred by most political scientists is an era where ordinary voters don't feel very enthusiastic, don't feel they have choices. Today, we have returned to record voter turnout in the US. Something that most political scientists were writing just 10 years ago was something of the past. Secular trends have meant that voters will never again come to the polls. The era of that kind of voter excitement is, no, it's back, right? Americans are coming to the polls in record numbers. In the same way in India, what India needed to become a fully functional democracy was a challenge to Congress hegemony. And that challenge to Congress hegemony also, well, originally came from the Janata Party, was the main challenger, which then, morphed. And I don't want to get into the fine details, and I don't even know the fine institutional details, but the BJP is clearly the successor party and claims to be the successor party of the Janata Party. And the BJP's success is, I think, on the whole, very healthy for Indian democracy, because the BJP has largely succeeded by professionalizing Indian democracy. Now, I know everyone does vote bank politics. Everyone tries to count the caste and the religious, getting a few people here and there at the margins. But fundamentally, BJP has appealed to people on the modern basis of, we have a policy set, vote for us for our policies. They've professionalized. They're not dynastic. Yes, they have a very popular leader in Narendra Modi, but if Narendra Modi were to step down tomorrow, they would develop another popular leader, and there at least a couple people waiting in the wings. It is a highly professional political party. In India, I repeatedly hear it referred to as a vote gathering machine. Well, every political party should be a vote gathering machine. And what that's going to do is it's going to force other Indian parties to modernize. To the extent that the Congress Party is reluctant to modernize, to the extent that the Gandhi family continues to seek to run the Congress Party as a fiefdom, other parties will take their place. And we've seen that with the rise of the Aam Aadmi Party. The Aam Aadmi Party, I don't know as much about, but my impression is that, again, it's a thoroughly modern political party running as a political vote-gathering machine that will do what it takes to get people to vote for it so it can implement its policy platform. Well, that's what modern political parties do. And I expect, whether it's Congress, whether it's a reformed Congress that reforms because of pressure from the Aam Aadmi Party, whether it's the Aam Aadmi Party that becomes a national party, or whether it's someone else, TMC or Nitish Kumar or somebody, but somebody will ultimately succeed in professionalizing the anti-BJP opposition in India. And when they do, India will tend towards more of a two-party system. It'll probably never be a straight two-party system like the US, but it will move probably to something more like Australia, where there are two major political parties and many smaller ones.
Okay. I believe Ram has a question next for you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Ramesh, and Professor Babones. Welcome to the seminar. Thanks for sharing your mind space with us. So let me ask this question. I know you've been focusing on India's democratic health and the faulty or negative narratives surrounding it, actually. Would you be expanding your interest to other areas as well, such as economy, its religious diversity, the freedom that's out there, social dynamics, and perhaps even sports, which would be cricket, since you are in Australia, I'm sure you understand cricket a lot. So, why don't you expand, why don't you share some of your thoughts along these lines?
If we have extra time at the end, ask me for my cricket story. But as for the rest, look, my original interest was the economy, and I did spend quite a bit of time studying the economy. And when I used to write for a foreign policy magazine, for a while I was doing a weekly column for Foreign Policy magazine. I regularly covered economic reform issues in India. So I did a piece on Bangalore's app industry. I did a piece on the farmer protests. But really my interest has shifted very much towards studying democratic institutions and things relating to that. Now, I am working on a paper right now on freedom of religion in India, but my focus, just as with the democracy rankings paper, my focus is not on freedom of religion as such. My focus is on the freedom of religion rankings. Right. So my own specialty as an academic is quantitative comparative analysis, and in particular, what's called latent variable analysis. So how we study, how we get things like an overall score of a ranking out of the raw data that we have. And so I've applied that to the democracy rankings. My next paper will apply that to Pew's international religious freedom rankings. And I enjoy doing that work, but I'm never going to be an expert on Indian religions. I'm never going to be an expert. I may eventually become an expert on the Indian economy, though I put that aside for now. And I'm certainly not going to be an expert on sport. But my strength, look, culture is not my strength. I freely admit that. What I'm really interested in is these democracy rankings and everything associated with the democracy rankings and why they have misranked India.
Yeah, in this context, I saw your tweet about Chad Bobbin's book on Christians being, violence against Christians in India. That's an interesting topic. I know you may be pursuing it with Suhak Shukla and others.
No, I came across his book in research for this paper, and I saw when I saw that quote, I thought, wow, I'm not going to wait for the paper to tweet this. I want to get it out there. The fact that hostility towards Christians in India, while a real thing, I mean, I don't think any international expert would dismiss the reality that some Christians have faced violence in India. But what I'm interested in is the rate of violence. And his conclusion, and it's his research, not mine, was that the rate of hostility towards Christians in India was lower than the rate of hostility towards Muslims and far lower than the hostility towards Jews in the United States. And he said, and he stressed this, there wasn't room for it in the tweet. He actually stressed, and this is even allowing for the possibility that he may have vastly underestimated hostility towards Christians in India. No one denies their individual cases. I'd love to discuss the difference between social science and journalistic perspectives on this, the individual case versus systematic analysis. But when you come to the systematic analysis, the hostility to religion just isn't there in India.
And again, I don't want to take my other colleagues' time here, but briefly, because since this kind of connects to Huntington's thesis about civilizational stuff and the quarrels, Christians, Muslims, and so on. I don't know if that is something that you're going to maybe pursue later, but I believe Avatans has a question for you.
Yes, my question, Professor, is Professor Arvind Sharma. He's a very renowned professor of Indian religion and Hinduism and all. He talks about when it comes to it comes to narratives and academics and all about India. It's the trend has been, from outsider to insider, right? So while that is true because of the Orientalism, Indology, and then later on in modern time Marxism has kind of defined what India is and what the Indian religion tradition is, and we see that the same process in the modern academia and also in media. You have been very successful, at least in recent times, if I'm allowed to say that through your tweets and social media appearances and all that. But why do you think is that the people like, let's say, Professor Ramesh Rao, he's not able to write for Wall Street Journal, but another.
Well, neither am I.
Right. Or Vikram Sampath is not writing for New York Times, but somebody like Rana Ayub, or they're writing, or even Walter Russell Mead is writing. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Access to the most prestigious media outlets is, of course, highly competitive. And as a result, it's highly politicized. People put their own people in. So, for example, I was writing for over a year, I was writing a weekly column for Foreign Policy magazine. It wasn't because I submitted something in Foreign Policy and somehow got in. It was because I knew the new editor. He brought me in as one of his columnists. He was aware of my work. And then when he stepped down and a new editor came in, I was let go. Right. So it's very much, because it's such desirable intellectual territory, it's very much based on personal connections. It is possible to break into that world, but it is difficult. So use the example of Rana Ayub. There are, I'm sure, dozens of young Muslim woman Marxist or critical authors in India who would absolutely, desperately want to be writing for the Washington Post. Why do they publish her every month instead of getting one of these dozens of very intelligent, critical young Muslim women? There's people who fit identical profiles to her. Well, she's the brand, right? She's now known to them. And once you become known and once you become the brand, and not the brand for the public necessarily, but for the editors, they'll keep coming back to the same people. So the fact that, so we need to separate two things. The fact that the Washington Post would want to have a young female critical Muslim as a columnist, and the fact that among the dozens of highly talented people, they've specifically chosen Rana Ayub. That second is almost certainly driven by personal connections, and that's nothing nefarious. I mean, personal connections could simply mean you met someone at a conference and said, hey, could you take a look at my work? And that person was impressed, right? So there's nothing nefarious about that. But the more systematic question is, why is the Washington Post so excited about this kind of point of view? And why are prize committees so excited? I mean, we saw this bizarre situation a few years ago in Spain where a woman author was given a major prize, and the people who showed up to take it were two male authors who were writing under the pseudonym. And there was a big debate on one side saying, you know, look, they're a bunch of hypocrites. They don't think this writing is good now that they know it's male authored. On the other side, people saying, oh no, these people, you know, misrepresented themselves to the public. And there's truth in both, right? I mean, let's be honest. There's truth in both sides. In the same way, you know, the Washington Post would be excited about a young female critical Muslim author in a way that if you said a conservative male Hindu Indian author, no interest for them, right? It's not exciting to them. And that reflects their worldview. You know, I think everyone's aware of what the Washington Post's worldview is. And so they select who they want. The problem is there's no problem in that, right? Each of these media outlets produces an output that we're very familiar with, and all of us can kind of guess. You know, we all know, Shekhar Gupta once did a great little clip about if something's going to be in The Guardian, if The Guardian's going to report on cricket, I know exactly what they'll say. The Guardian will say, in this country where hundreds of millions of people go to bed every night hungry, you know, a cricket game was won, right? And so we all know that, we laugh at it. The problem, there's only a problem when there's no venue for alternative viewpoints. And that's what, you know, again, to mention Jonathan Haidt and his work at the Heterodox Academy, that's what that's really all about. It's not saying that someone like Rana Ayub should not have a platform. It's saying that, no, we need platforms for lots of points of view if we really want to understand the world. And if the mainstream media won't platform those points of views, they can't very well get so upset when alternative media platform those points of views.
Yeah.
Okay, I believe Nishant has a question.
Yeah, actually, I think we were talking, and I think I missed the second part of the question that was there.
Sorry, two-part questions. I always
that's fine. That's fine.
One question at a time is always my recommendation.
That's okay. So, have you done any kind of comparative study as to what the blind spots in India's response are in terms of like the global defame it receives, in terms of economics? So, you know, the policy is not getting, you know, out in open more or talked about. I know Dr. Jaishankar now has been, you know, punching way about his weight or India's weight, so to speak. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. So I haven't done any systematic study of it, but I do follow. I follow the middle income tier of the world reasonably closely in a comparative way. And India's response has been very similar to Poland's response, Brazil's response under Bolsonaro, Jair Bolsonaro. For that matter, I don't want to compare India and Russia, but just in terms of its responses, you know, Russia's response and response of Russians intellectuals, which is to say it's been a proud knee-jerk defensiveness. And, you know, Dr. Jaishankar is, I would characterize just as much in that way, you know, as I would the societal response. Now, that's understandable. It's not something I would condemn. I mean, certainly when Dr. Jaishankar defends India, from what I can tell, everything he's saying, I mean, I can't categorically say everything, but substantially everything that he's saying is correct. Right. But what he's saying is not really well calculated to persuade the publics in Western countries. That is, what he's saying seems calculated to please voters in India, which is, of course, just as much, if not more, his job right. as you know, as doing public diplomacy. Look, success in public diplomacy would be furthered much more by an openness, by willingness to talk, by being less defensive, by conceding some of the valid points raised by opponents, but contextualizing them, by presenting data. So I don't think India has really done a very good job, and it's India broadly speaking. The government, Indian nationalists have not done a very good job of presenting their case in a way that would persuade Western elite publics. Do they need to do that? That's up to them. But if they don't do that, they'll continue to face if they don't do that, then the people who read the New York Times will trust the New York Times. The people who read the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal will trust the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal. If they don't have an accessible counter narrative that's directed towards them, why shouldn't they trust their own newspapers when it comes to India, just as they trust their own newspapers when it comes to South Africa or China or any other country?
Quickly, can I interject, Professor? So do you see any disconnect between, you brought up elite point of view, how we respond to elites, or Dr. Jaishankar is doing. Do you see a disconnect between what elites think and what normal people like us, my neighbors think of India? Do you see anything different?
Well, there's a disconnect among informed people, but remember, you, even if you live in the US, are much more informed about India than non-Indian heritage Americans. Non-Indian heritage Americans don't have an opinion about India, right? I mean, they may hear about India once a year. And if that once a year they hear about India is a claim that Indian democracy, that India is no longer a democracy, well, why should they have any other view? It's not on their mind. I mean, and for that, just substitute the word for the word India, substitute the word Cambodia. Why would you expect people, ordinary Americans, ordinary Australians who are not of Indian background, to have any knowledge of Cambodia, to even know what its political system is? And if all they hear is once a year, Cambodia is run by a China-friendly communist regime, well, why would they question that? They're not going to go in and delve into Cambodian politics and try to get to the root of it. In the same way, why should they question Indian politics? So there's not so much a disconnect between what elites and ordinary people think, as there's simply elites have an opinion. I think most ordinary people still think of India in terms that are 100 years out of date. They may not. I would be willing to bet that if you asked people, is India part of the British Empire, you would get a substantial fraction of Americans who say yes. Probably 20, 25, 30% of Americans would still have that impression of India. Look, I teach at universities, and I once had a master's student in the United States, not here in Australia, but a master's student who wrote me a paper, a social policy paper, and I teach international social policy. This person wrote a paper saying that the main problem facing China today was opium, and that the Chinese emperor's efforts to outlaw opium had been stymied by British imperialism, and that what China really needed was reform to get rid of the imperialists and outlaw opium. And with a straight face, the student wrote this. Now, this is a master's student. That's the level of ignorance, not only of China, but we would find a similar level of ignorance of India among most Americans, Australians, British people who don't actively pay attention to the region.
Thank you.
Ram, you have a question?
Yes, the next question. I actually see a souvenir which kind of looks like a crystal ball, Professor. So I have a question along those lines. If you have a crystal ball, how does the future of India, China, Europe, Russia look like in the context of the power and the influence Islam and Christianity wields today?
I don't have a crystal ball. I do have a Ganesh statue over there, so I'll look for inspiration to Ganesh. Look, there are specific areas in which organized Christian activism and organized Islamist activism have the potential to shape the global stage, but that the space for that is very narrow. That is, on very narrow specific issues, these organizations are able to wield electoral influence or wield political influence, but only on those specific issues. So they're not going to change the broader nexus of U.S.-Russia relations, U.S.-China relations, the shape of geopolitics. But for example, is it possible that India would, in the next 10 years, in this decade, that India would face low-level sanctions similar to the sorts of sanctions Israel faces? Yeah, I think there's the real potential for that. Will that translate into reconfiguration of geopolitics? No, I mean, India's economy is too large. India is growing too rapidly. There are lots of opportunities. Western business wants to invest in India. American defense contractors desperately want to sell weaponry to India. I mean, there are big material reasons why geopolitics would be resistant to these kinds of efforts. But in narrow, targeted ways, yes, this kind of activism will likely have an effect specifically on India, as it has specifically over the last 20, 30 years. The boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign has had an effect on Israel.
Okay. Thanks.
Let me kind of see if you can explore a little bit more on that. And I think there's also a question from one of our viewers today that might refer to that. And this is when, have you read Caldwell's book on Islam and Europe?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. That's something, because some of the questions that we wanted to ask today was, this kind of religious dynamic and how.
Yeah, I don't know the book, but I'm familiar with the debate on Islam in Europe.
Yeah. Because that, while clearly, yes, in terms of the, global economy, exchange of information, technology, all of, those are the driving forces. Leaders may want to focus on that. But then yet we cannot ignore that what about 120 of the 193, whatever, UN, nations within the UN are Christian, 50 are Muslim. And there is, and they have been the driving religious forces in shaping even, modern political dynamics.
Yeah.
And this is where I think, the Hindu part of it, because, our talk today is not just about India, but, we say, oh, it's a Hindu majority country, minorities under threat. But then when you actually look at the dynamics on the ground, again, the kind of data that go uncollected, that would show a different picture. Because in terms of the views, maybe of the unwashed Americans, they know nothing about India or Hindu. They don't.
We're all very clean, Ramesh. We're all very clean people.
But they do know that most probably their doctor is going to be an Indian, most probably a Hindu. Yeah. But beyond that, for example, in Columbus, a small town in Georgia, not small town, small city,
sure.
We have, Christian groups that will listen to Indian Christians talk about, the history of Indian Christianity, how Hindus are targeting them, how they need this kind of support. They get to gather monies here. And so there is a dynamic just under the surface that I don't know if you are going to probe further, but let me see if I can connect one of the questions that a viewer has. He says, what shall we make of the U.S. Bill 5665, so strongly supported by the Democrats and opposed by the Republicans? And this is the Combating International Islamophobia Act. Mm-hmm. And whether you want to kind of comment on that dynamic, what is happening, how maybe you think that can influence democracy?
Sure. So once again, you're asking two very different questions. One is about influence at the United Nations, and one is about influence in American or Western domestic politics. At the United Nations, it is, of course, a challenge for India that countries do form blocs, and the United Nations is on the principle of one country, one vote. So there's no weighted voting. India doesn't get to speak for 1.4 billion people. It gets the same vote as Luxembourg or Liechtenstein, and that's just part of the setup of the United Nations. As a result, of course, in the General Assembly, India is likely to be increasingly vilified. And again, I think the model for what's happening to India now is the playbook we've already seen for Israel over the last 2 decades. And I think you can expect a lot more of that over the course of the 2030s. I think there's a lot of literal overlap between the very same people and organizations that have spent 20 years vilifying Israel under the banner of anti-Zionism are now turning to anti-Hindutva and taking that same playbook and applying it to India. Of course, Israel's greatest resource at the United Nations has been its American alliance. India, and I've said repeatedly in interviews that one reason India has not condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that ultimately, at least for now, India's veto on the Security Council is Russia. Countries around the world have patrons on the Security Council, and unless and until India can rely on a U.S. veto, it has to rely on that Russian veto. Now, will India ever get a U.S. veto? A lot of that depends on domestic U.S. politics, and this goes to the second half of your question. Indian Americans, and specifically Hindu Indian Americans, are increasingly mobilizing civil society groups, and those pressure groups have the potential to start influencing U.S. politics. They're a decade or two behind Muslim American groups who've been organizing, I think, for a little longer. And for whatever reason, I mean, there's a lot of emotion behind it. For whatever reason, Muslim Indians, when they go to the U.S. or go to Australia or Canada, tend to integrate into the larger Muslim society of those countries, whereas Hindu Indians and Sikh Indians tend to remain distinct as Sikh communities or as Hindu communities in their societies, right? So we have this strange tension that within America, there are not only Islamists who tend to be, not always, but have a predisposition maybe to be anti-India because they're Islamists, and in an international affairs sense, they may be anti-India. That's combining with Indian Muslim Americans who are fighting Indian domestic politics in America. Right. So we have this confluence between these two streams. It's easy to forget that, Indian Muslims make up a substantial portion of the American Muslim community, and for that matter, a substantial portion of the global Muslim Ummah. I mean, it's 250 million people. It's a lot of people, and a lot of people who in America largely have high incomes. They're largely professionals, and so they're people who are very active in civil society. So we see this fault line emerging in the U.S. between Indian Muslim Americans, supported by a broader set of Muslim community organizations, and Indian Hindu Americans, who are their own group, who identify much more closely with India as such, the country. How that will play out in U.S. politics is difficult to say. It depends on the success of these groups in mobilizing. The Christian angle is an interesting one. That's what my new paper, which will come out in about a month, next paper will focus on, because the Christian angle is a bit of a strange bedfellows situation of, if most American evangelical groups, if anything, would tend towards Islamophobia as opposed to tending towards alliance with American Muslims. But because of the lobbying by Christian missionary and proselytizing groups in India, there's also something of an anti-India sentiment. And we have to see which of those two, because of course evangelical Christians, and for that matter Catholic Christians, are a much larger force in American politics than either Muslim Americans or Indian Americans. Right. We'll have to see which way that community ultimately turns in terms of its overall support. Right now, I think the awareness is relatively low. Yeah, so there's a lot of fighting for the soul, so to speak, of Christian Americans with regard to India. I think, if I can be very frank, I think Hindu Americans have not done a very good job of Christian outreach, that is, of trying to stress the commonalities. I mean, I'll make that, again, very practical. If you read Dr. Rajiv Malhotra's Snakes in the Ganga, his criticisms of Harvard and the American intellectual establishment in Snakes in the Ganga are almost exactly parallel to Christian conservative criticisms of Harvard University and the American intellectual establishment. So why isn't Dr. Malhotra speaking in front of dozens of Christian groups? It's that sort of alliance, I think, that would be that might be very productive for Indian Americans in trying to fight some of the stigmatization that is not just on the horizon, but has started to arrive for Hindus in the United States.
Yeah, I see some of those trends in especially in AM radio kind of things, that some of the Indian narratives or Hindu narratives coming up a little bit positive, especially because of the rise of Narendra Modi.
Salvatore, did you hear Avatan's?
Sorry, it wasn't a question.
Okay. There is a question from one of our viewers, Dr. Shendunikar from Vadodara says, what are your observations about the state of social sciences and humanities education in the West, and how much of its imprint do you see in India, and what could be the consequences of where social scientists and academics are treading, both for the West and India?
Look, the social sciences, humanities we are digging our own graves. And it's sad to see, but there's an enormous amount of self-indulgence in academia. We're given almost complete academic freedom to do whatever we want, both in our teaching and in our research, subject to only the farthest borders of civility. We can go right up to them, sometimes past them, while still retaining our jobs. And as a result, many social scientists and humanities scholars have taken advantage of that. They've been self-indulgent to the point of conflating their own political views with their academic work, to the point where if you read a lot of, not the very best academic journals, but if you read a lot of second-tier academic journals today, much of the content published in them is not actually research. It's more statement of politics, or research thinly veiled as politics, selective cherry picking of results in order to promote a certain point of view. Now that has also affected the sciences. I mean, so for example, during COVID, we saw the problems the Danish mask researchers had in publishing their study, which did not show a significant protective effect of masks. And even though they were pro-masking, they just couldn't publish their study. Now, that became famous and notorious because of COVID. But in the humanities and social sciences, this has just been par for the course. I mean, it's very difficult to get anything past peer review that doesn't accord with the political viewpoints of your colleagues who are peer reviewing you, which is why I've been publishing my recent research in Quadrant instead of in peer-reviewed journals. It's simply become so politicized that when someone like me sends an article for peer review that challenges a received political wisdom, and I'm not talking the scientific consensus. No, this is nothing like climate change or COVID. This is simply the received political wisdom of the profession. It's simply rejected, not on the grounds of here's an error in the research, but on the grounds of, this research is an apology for fascism. This research is, dangerous, or, it's not, the criticisms are very clearly political. Now, not just for me. This is not a wine session for Salvatore Babones. This is something that has been widely written about. We're all very aware of it. The upshot of this, however, has been the marginalization of the social sciences and humanities, which is to say we're not getting new jobs. Yes, those of us who have jobs are keeping them, but recruitment has shrunk to a trickle. We're still educating enormous numbers of PhD students, who then are angry that they've spent 5-7 years doing a PhD and there are no jobs, and they almost seem to demand the academy owes us a job. And I think, well, in some sense it does, but there are no jobs. What do you want us to do? Student numbers are dwindling. Students only seem to take humanities and social science classes at many universities as part of the distribution requirements. So many of our departments have been reduced to offering what are called service classes. That is, we're offering, so a criminology major that focuses on police procedure may offer a intro to sociology as a required class for that criminology degree. And so we offer the required class. So we're all across humanities and social sciences, disciplines are disappearing, and we have a crisis. And there are repeated articles in our professional newsletters about the crises we face. Very few people want to face up to the reality that the crisis is caused by us. It's our own self-indulgence that has caused the crisis. It's very easy for conservatives to cherry pick the titles of fringe, almost lunatic-sounding humanities classes and to say, look how ridiculous that is. How can Stanford University pay for this? But those conservatives seem not to realize that, and 5 students are registering when engineering has thousands, and nursing has thousands. Students are deserting us. And as students desert us, we are ultimately not reproducing ourselves. Disciplines have died before. Disciplines will die in the future. Unfortunately, many of the social sciences and humanities disciplines are now going through a process of retrenchment. I mean, to put that in perspective, in Australia, there are 39 major public universities. I think, I haven't counted recently, but I think there are only 5 or 6 sociology departments among those 39 universities.
Wow.
University of Western Australia just disbanded its sociology department. University of Western Australia is one of our group of 8, the 8 major research-intensive universities in Australia. And 2 years ago, it just said, we don't need sociology anymore. And it's not just sociology, humanities disciplines. University of Sydney has eliminated its religion department. We went from having departments of Hebrew studies, Christian studies. Then we had a religious studies department, and now we just have cultural studies, which has 1 or 2 people who study religion within our culture. So it's all consolidating and disappearing.
Is that the same trend in the US as well?
Yeah. This is America and Australia. Now, you asked about India. In India, of course, there's been this fashion for the establishment of liberal arts universities. So we've seen, Shankar University, Jindal University, some of these prestigious liberal arts universities, which are primarily places to warehouse the children of the rich and middle class who haven't achieved positions elsewhere. Right? If I can just be very frank, there are a small number of students at these universities who, well, not a small number. I mean, many of the students are actually, from what I've heard from colleagues, excellent students. But all across the middle income zone of the world, whether it's India, Russia, China, Latin America, notoriously, Eastern Europe, all produce far too many university educated people because the middle classes in those countries, for obvious reasons, all want their children to get university degrees, yet there aren't enough jobs in those societies for people with university degrees. And the result is that some segment of the population simply gets a degree for respectability purposes. And in Latin America, that's been the case for 50 years of a vast overproduction, mainly of humanities and social sciences university degrees, of people who end up then with no gainful employment or are not employed anywhere in the area of their degrees because there just isn't employment for all the people who want degrees.
Yeah, I believe we are close to running out of time. And I think this is a question about, as I mentioned, about the nature of objectivity, about what has happened in academia, but also in the media. Because I was also trained as a journalist. I was a copy editor for The Hindu, which now I can't read because it has become such a kind of a completely left-oriented anti-Hindu newspaper that it's almost kind of a travesty to still call it The Hindu. Given all of that, and given your other commitments, I know we've got to call it a day. So I want to thank you first. I hope we can come back again when your schedule slows down a little, and also so that you have time to do your other serious work. So first of all, thank you for being with us today. I also want to thank my co-hosts today, Avatans, Nishant, and Ram. And of course, also I want to thank our India Facts people in Hyderabad, Bharat, for setting up this Zoom things, and also for the viewers who took some time today to listen to you. We will have this video recorded. I know we have recorded this. We are going to therefore hopefully see more people come and listen to you.
Dhanyavadagalu.
Dhanyavadagalu.
Thank you very much.
Namaskar, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and before I let you go, in terms of the Kannada, writers that you want to read, D.V. Gundappa, you may want to just, because he also wrote in English. And that's
fantastic.
Okay, I will send you a message about it. Okay.
Great.
All right. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure.